Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out to this wonderful evening with Major Jackson. I'm Mary Ide from the Friends of the Library. The Friends of the Library support the First Wednesday series, but we're joined by several local businesses, and I'd just like to recognize them for their year-long help. That includes the Brattleboro Camera Club, the Retreat, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Downs, Racklin and Martin, New Chapter, and the Wyndham World Affairs Council. They are our steadfast supporters. I just want to make two very quick announcements. On Friday, April 15th at 7 o'clock, we have a concert of kora music. The kora is a 21-string harp from West Africa. So please join us for an evening with Sean Gaskell playing the kora on April 15th. The second thing is we have our wonderful paperback, DVD, and CD sale April 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. And this year we have literally hundreds of brand new nonfiction and fiction books from Penguin Publishers. So you'll want to come to that. So I'd like to introduce Carol Gaddis, who has been on the Vermont Humanities Council Board for 3 years, and she will introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. It's an honor and great pleasure to welcome you to Brattleboro's first Wednesday in April with Major Jackson. Thank you to the Vermont Department of Libraries and National Life Group Foundation for their statewide support of this series of events, and especially to the Brattleboro Library and its members. Major Jackson is an American poet, professor, and the author of 4 collections of poetry. Roll Deep, his latest collection, was just published last year. Holding Company and Hoops were both finalists for an NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literature Poetry. Leaving Saturn was the winner of the 2001 Cave Canem Poetry Prize and finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award. He has been honored by the Pew Foundation, the Pew Fellowship in the Arts and the Witter-Brunner Foundation in conjunction with the Library of Congress. Jackson is the Richard Dennis Green and Gold Professor at the University of Vermont and a core faculty member of the Bennington Writing Seminars. He served as a Creative Arts Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, as the Jack Kerouac Writer-in-Residence at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and currently serves as the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. Major's new collection of poetry, Roll Deep, takes you on a voyage from Philadelphia to the Greek islands to civil war in Africa. His poems are introspective and have a lyrical sensibility. Mark Doty's review notes that Major's voice seems to have broken loose, allowing for all manner of praise and lament, for observation and mediation, the grim and the goofball, and for outbreaks of pure sorcery, where punctuation is my jury and the moon is my judge. I present to you Major Jackson.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Wonderful. Here's an empty cup here. Seriously, a tremendous, tremendous pleasure to being here. Particularly because this organization was a part of my life. Can you see it? The Vermont Humanities Council. For 8 years, I was a member of the board, and really happy to be here in Brattleboro under the auspices of the Vermont Humanities Councils, and particularly its first Wednesday series, which frankly I truly believe has enriched the lives of a great deal of Vermonters. And this is my first event under the auspices of the Vermont Humanities Council, and I'm happy to be on the other side. And I want to acknowledge my friend Carol Gaddis and Jeff for hosting me. I publicly thank them for underwriting this event and continuing our fellowship beyond, although under the auspices, but they're just great people. I also want to thank Mary Ellen Bixby for her years of service on the board of the Vermont Humanities Council. And Brattleboro has been, since I arrived here in Vermont 14 years ago, just this very supportive community for my work, offer me several times an opportunity to be a part of the festival. But frankly, anytime I go south, I stop here and snag your books and hang out at Joe's Cafe and do all manner of stuff here. So I'm very happy and delighted to be in the Brooks Memorial Library, and also want to thank the staff for hosting tonight's event like they've hosted so many Vermont Humanities Council events. It's a great partnership. So thank you again, and thank you for all my friends in the audience. April Osman is here, and Tim Mayo, and a number of all manner of people. Thank you for being here. I moved here, as I said, 14 years ago, and I grew up in Philadelphia. So I consider myself a city kid. So when I moved here, I was worried about becoming a nature poet. Because the natural beauty here is just so overwhelming and wonderful. And finally, I started writing poems after about 10 years that take place here in Vermont. You'll hear some of those, and you'll also hear some of my obsessions, which does have to do with landscape, but also, I would say, art in general, poetry in general, language, how language becomes an experience beyond our everyday usage. I'll read poems that are historically based, and my hope is that maybe during the question and answer, if that's time permitting, we have an opportunity to engage in a conversation around not just these poems, but quite possibly even beyond questions of creative process, which I've answered so many of those. Quite possibly, what does it mean, which is somewhat tonight's theme. What does it mean? What is the role of poetry, and why is it important in our lives? To that end, I want to start off with a poem that I wrote almost 10 years ago. I travel quite a bit and on airplanes, and often, as you know, if you travel on an airplane by yourself, you'll meet someone who's your neighbor sitting next to you, and often that person will ask you, what do you do? And if I feel like talking, I'll say I'm a professor, and they'll say, what? Of what? And I'll say, English. And then they'll ask where, and I'll say, Vermont. And we can begin all manner of discussion. But if I do not feel like talking, I'll say I'm a poet. And that normally shuts down the conversation. I can start going to sleep, making my jacket a pillow. But on one such occasion, when I said I'm a poet and went to go rest my head on the window in seat 18A, a gentleman said, exasperatedly I might add, "Why?" And I leaned up and I was really upset that I didn't have an answer for him, some canned answer. And so when I arrived at my destination, I started this poem. I didn't finish it in one sitting, but I started it nonetheless. It's called Why I Write Poetry. Because my son is as old as the stars. Because I have no blessings. Because I hold tangerines like orange tennis balls. Because I sit alone and welcome morning across the unshaded jaws of my lawn. Because the houses on my street sleep like turtles. Because the proper weight of beauty was her eyes last night beneath my eyes. Because the red goblet from which I drank made even water a Faustian toast. Because radishes should be banned, little pellets that they are. Because someone says it's late and begins to rise from a chair. Because life is ordinary unless you plan and set in motion a war. Because I have not thanked enough. Because my lips moisten whenever I hear Mingus's goodbye pork pie hat. Because I plant winter vegetables in July. Because I could say the morning died like candle wax and no one would question its truth. Because I relish being sent into the coat room in 3rd grade where alone I would turn off the lights and run my hands over my classmates' coats as if playing tag with their bodies. Because once I shoplifted a pair of Hawaiian shorts and was caught at the Gallery Mall. Because soup reminds me of the warmth of my grandmother and old aunts. Because the long coast of my dreams is filled with saxophones and poems. Because somewhere, someone is buying a Rolex or Piaget. Because I wish I could speak 3 different languages, but have to settle for the language of business and commerce. Because I used to wear paisley shirts and herringbone sports jackets, because I better get it in my soul. Because my grandfather loved clean syntax, cologne, Stacey Adams shoes, Irish tweed caps, and women, but not necessarily in that order. Because I think the elderly are sexy and the young are naive and brutish. Because a vision of trees only comes to wise women and men who can fix old watches. Because I write with a pen whose supply of ink comes from the sea. Because gardens are fun to visit in the evenings when everyone has put away their coats and swords. Because I still do not eat corporate French fries. Because punctuation is my jury and the moon is my judge. Because my best friend in 4th grade chased city buses from corner to corner. His father could not stop looking up at the sky after his return from the war. Because parataxis is just another way of making ends meet. Because I have been on a steady diet of words since the age of 3.
Nice.
So I mentioned my fear of becoming a nature poet, and it's an unnecessary worry. I realize that so much of my poetry is informed by the landscape. And so I want to read this poem, Ode to my Mount Philo, which is in, I want to say Charlotte, but some might argue Ferrisburg. And it's a place when I first arrived here, I took a number of hikes. Ode to Mount Philo. After avocado-colored inclines, after dawdling ascents over fern and foliage, after long trillium gazes and careful steppings over outcrops of rocks, which, if not careful, could trip to foil, after delicate trail talk of marriages and births, dates remembered, quarrels squashed, the tentative pace of the new in-law, the sure-footedness of the long-ago loved. After stop-offs to catch breath, a swig and quaff. To take this much in, midway up journey, this resting place to further peaks and crests. After foothold and climb, after storm's last sculpture of fallen trees. You, summit of my life, philosophy of sky. You, embezzler of breaths from big and small mouths, so that all whisper your spread out tabernacle a new religion. You ritual burst of mountain light and sparkling lake, for which we line up, taking our turns, and spawns of clicks and screens. Panorama of foothills like green coats thrown open, clouds, if only we could reach, and cup into our hands. And below, a stitched patchwork of land, lime pastured like flattened squares of kale. We look, we marvel at how far we traveled through emerald glitter and beams. So I want to take you to one of my obsessions, which, as I mentioned earlier, is my home city, Philadelphia, where there were, in my neighborhood, a group of young men who played excellent games of chess. And I grew up playing chess with my father, and I played chess growing up with my children. And yet, these young men, were you to look at them, they would not look like the kind of men you think were chess masters, grand chess masters. To say that they did not share the privileges that you and I share today would be an understatement. But yet there they were, and they became quite famous. So famous that Hollywood made a movie about them. They were known, a traveling team, they were known as the Bad Bishops. But the movie, if you look it up on YouTube, is called Mighty Pawns. So if you want to see a bad B-rated film, look up Mighty Pawns, which is the name of this poem. Mighty Pawns. If I told you Earl, the toughest kid on my block in North Philadelphia, bow-legged and ominous, could beat any man or woman in 10 moves playing white, or that he traveled to Yugoslavia to frustrate the bearded masters at the Belgrade Chess Association, you'd think I was given to hyperbole. And if, at dinner time, I took you into the faint light of his Section 8 home, reeking of onions, liver, and gravy, his 6 little brothers fighting on a broken love seat for room in front of a cracked flat screen, one whose diaper sags, it's a wonder it hasn't fallen to his ankles, The walls behind doors exposing sheetrock, the perfect O of a handle. And the slats of stairs missing where baby boy gets stuck trying to ascend to a dominion foreign to you and me, with its loud timbales and drums blasting down from the closed room of his cousin, whose mother stands on a corner on the other side of town all times of day and night. Except when her relief check arrives at the beginning of the month. You'd get a better picture of Earl's ferocity after school in Mr. Sherman's class. But not necessarily when he stands near you at a downtown bus stop in a jacket a size too small, hunching his shoulders around his ears as you imagine the checkered squares of his poverty and anger, and pray he does not return his precise gaze too long in your direction, for fear he blames you and proceeds to take your queen. Back to Vermont. I was just in North Carolina, and the Smoky Mountains are just stunning. They're just beautiful. And while there, I realized, although not in the same amount of grandeur, there's much to be shared among the mountain folk in North Carolina and here in Vermont. A place where I had to explain that we like our syrup, we like our cheese, we like our cows, who I was told outnumber humans when I first arrived. I'm not sure if that's the case. We like our loon cries. If you happen to be on a lake, you'll hear loons. But I wrote this poem because until about a couple years ago, my wife had never seen fireflies. And we were in Bennington, so I wanted to honor that moment. And we like our swimming holes. And there's a little Missy Elliott and a little Wallace Stevens in this poem, if you're so inclined. Enchanters of Addison County. We were more than gestural, close listening. The scent of manure riding its waft on the leaves off Route 22A. By nightfall, our gaze fled like loon cries, but no one was up for turnips, nor other roots, not least of which the clergy. Romanticism has its detractors, which is why we lined the road with tea-lit luminaries and fresh-cut lemons. We called it making magic. Then stormed the corners and porches of general stores, kissing whenever cars idled at four-way stop signs, or sought grade A maple syrup in tin containers with scenes of horse-drawn farmers plowing through snow. The silhouetted rusted farm equipment gave us the laid-back heaven we so often wished, and fireflies bequeath earth stars, such blink and blank and bunk-a-bunk bunk. And of course we wondered if we existed, and also too the cows in the ancient pastures and the white milk inside our heads, like church spires and ice cream cones. Even after all that cha-cha-cha, we still came out of swimming holes, shivering our hearts out. Going back to Philadelphia, I had a guy in my neighborhood when I grew up as a kid who was a source of amusement for me and my friends. His name was Steve. And Steve, slightly older, who wore a tie and shirt and slacks and shoes, would walk around like he was driving a car. And this was, like I said, not only a source of amusement for me and my friends, but also for girls who would ask him for a ride. And he would pretend to back the car up to the curb and then walk around and open the door. No one got in. To my knowledge, would have been great to see. But I also like the fact that he was just there. He was part of our community. You understand? Some kind of crazy. It doesn't matter if you can't see Steve's Corvette. Turquoise colored, plush purple seats, gold trim rims that make little stars in your eyes, as if the sun is kneeling, kissing the edge of sanity. Like a Baptist preacher stroking the dark underside of God's wet tongue, he can make you believe it's there. His scuffed wingtips, ragged, shuffling concrete, could be 10-inch Firestone wheels. His vocal cords fake an 8-cylinder engine that wags like a dog's tail as he shifts gears. Imagine Steve, moonstruck, cool, turning right onto Ridge Avenue, arms forming arcs, his hands a set of stiff C's, overthrowing each other's rule, his lithe body and head snapping back, pushing a stick shift into fourth, whizzing past the pawn shop, past the stop and go. Only he knows his destination. Can you see him? Imagine Steve, moonstruck, cool, parallel parking between a Pacer and a Pinto. Obviously the most hip, backing up, head over right shoulder, one hand spinning as if polishing a dream. And there's Tina, wanting to know what makes a boy tick, wanting a one-way trip to the stars. We the faithful never call him crazy, crack-brained, just a little touched. It's all he ever wants: a car, a girl, a community of believers. So, if there's anyone under 40 in the room, you probably don't know, Pacer and a Pinto was a type of car. And they weren't good cars. They didn't last long. They were, and they look interesting. You know? The other poem I want to read from this first book, which I like reading from this book, because this book, its aim was to try to create portraits of people that I grew up with. One of them was a guy named Mr. Pate, who, although he didn't have kids of his own, he treated us, I say us, kids who came to his barbershop like we were family. And when I went off to college, I would come back to the old neighborhood and get a haircut, for which Mr. Pate would tell stories. And at some point I realized that these were cautionary tales. They were stories about friends or kids that I knew who were not as fortunate as I was to go off to college. And maybe about the fourth time I came back, I could see his demeanor changing. And in graduate school, I remembered him because I remember how emotional he was telling one story about a kid. But the other thing I want to say about Mr. Pate is that we kids shared a rumor about Mr. Pate, which is that, he was the only one in his shop, that when he swept up his hair, he never threw it away. And that he would put the hair in jars and keep them in the back of his shop like a mad scientist. And it was good to remember that. It's funny how when you start writing, you start stirring the deep recesses of what you feel is your imagination. It's almost like a dream reality. And there he was in that wonderful rumor that we had. Mr. Pate's barbershop. I remember the room in which he held a blade to my neck and scraped the dark hairs foresting a jawline. Stacks of ebonies and jets, clippings of black boxers, Joe Frazier, Jimmy Young, Jack Johnson. The color television bolted to a ceiling like the one I watched all night in the waiting room at St. Joseph's while my cousin recovered from gunshots. I remember the old Coke machine, a water fountain by the door, how I drank the summer of '88 over and over from a paper cone cup and still could not quench my thirst. For this was the year funeral homes boomed, the year Mr. Pate swept his own shop, for he had lost his best little helper to crossfire. He suffered, like most barbers suffered, quietly, his clippers humming so loud he forgot Ali's lightning left jab, his love for angles, for carpentry, for baseball. He forgot everything and would never be the same. I remember the way the blade gleamed fierce in the fading light of dusk, and a reflection of myself panned inside the razor's edge, wondering if I could lay down my pen, close up my ledgers and my journals, if I could undo my tie and take up barbering, where months on end a child's head would darken at my feet and bring with it the uncertainty of tomorrow. Or like Mr. Pate, gathering clumps of fallen hair at the end of a day in short, delicate wisps, as though they were the fine findings of gold dust he'd deposit in a jar and place on a shelf, only to return Saturdays, collecting as an antique dealer collects, growing tired, but never forgetting someone has to cherish these tiny little heads. So back to, where were we? We were in Philadelphia then. Why don't I'll tell you a story about this area. Going straight up 91, you're likely to hit Franconia, New Hampshire. And in Franconia is the house of Robert Frost. And the good people who are on the board there, when I first arrived, invited me to stay there one summer and write some poems. And I said very happily yes. But what they didn't tell me was that I said 91, off of Route 93 is a huge sign that says next stop, Robert Frost's house. Which meant at all times of the day and night, people would show up on the porch and peep in. And if it was in the morning, they got a nice surprise because I was there. And so I decided one morning to deal with my frustration of people showing up at Robert Frost's house. And let me just say, it's a great place if you haven't been. It's one of the many houses that he bought in New England. They have a great festival there. They have a Robert Frost Day. And I also think I wrote this poem because if you come to Vermont, you have to deal with him on some level. So this is from a letter that I wrote to another poet named Gwendolyn Brooks. I've arisen to dawn at the Frost place. I've jerry-rigged a desk by the window overlooking a trail. I'm the new face of mountain poetry. Tourists come and go, off hours though, interrupting my ego's pursuit, a lasting chamber for my soul. The worst is when I munch a bowl of frosted flakes, pacing in my briefs, and a right curious family peers in. They visor their foreheads. Disbelief creeps across their face. I am the old man's ghost. As were 26 beforehand, summers we come to haunt the porch. As William Matthews put it, to scorch off morning fog, which I poke with my pen and swirl. It gathers cobwebby light round thoughts I curl, then right to their end. The broccoli top trees I see down straight after that to Route 93. Tourists abound this time of year. I wish I could install on deck, I've not the word for what they're called, one of those standing boardwalk binoculars requiring a quarter that opens a shutter, then suddenly the ocean's particulars are as intimate as your face. Buttery midday light they'd see, my mind sputtering to complete these stanzas stacked like bricks, or mornings when I am my own exhibitionist. Catching me in the mirror, dancing nude, or toweling my hands, or stirring brown sugar in my tea. In any case, my back rudely to their probing eyes. To protect my chi, I'd hang a sign, beggars disallowed, or peace, God, or shh, poet at work. To really back them off, beware of jerk. A few more Vermont poems, I can call them that. I was mentioning today how much I enjoy and appreciate the beauty here, which has kept me in a state firmly, but there are some things that escape me that I don't quite understand, but you write about it to get closer to it. One of them is ice fishing. I don't understand it. So often traveling from New York and over the ferry through South Hero, you cross the lake, you can see a bunch of ice fishers there. And actually, I do find it quite beautiful, if not their tenacity to withstand the ice in the cold weather. This is called Fish and Wildlife. The lake's cold shacks of ice fishing anglers speeds by like homeless shanties. This is North Country. where a cabin's fireplace wears moose antlers, where the mesmeric drift of snow snakes Route 30, sending a chalk-white F-150 plummeting into a ditch. Icicles above Stewart's hover like liquid spears. A shawled neighbor in silhouette might be a witch, but you believe in the company of man and seek a cold beer and the crackling fire of a bar up the road, whose patrons talk of deadly snowmobile accidents steams its front window. Gossip turns the evening darker, and the nation might as well be this small, shadowy room, half in hunting gear, eyeing the blonde whipping some boy at a haloed pool table. Outside, a grumbling snowplow barrels up the street like a middle linebacker. A truckload of modern furniture sits in the parking lot. Yep, someone says, yep. Should have won that one, to a Bruins loss. The almost bare streets seem clutched in ice. Wind dusting up crystals in orange streetlight. Old men in Franklin County dream of being touched. Double view of the Adirondacks as reflected over Lake Champlain from Waterfront Park. The mountains are at their theater again, each ridge practicing an oration of scale and crest. And the sails, performing glides across the lake, complain for being outshadowed despite their gracious bows. 13 years in this state, what hasn't occurred? A cyclone in my spirit led to divorce. 4 books gave darkness an echo of control. My slurred hand finding steadiness by the prop of a page, and God, my children, whom I scarred, pray they forgive. My crimes felt mountainous, yet perspective came with distance, and like those peaks once keening beneath biting ice, then felt resurrection in a vestige of water unfrozen, cascading and adding to the lake's death. Such have I come to gauge my own screaming. The masts tipped so far they appear to capsize, keeling over where every father is a boat on water. The wakes carry the memory of battles, and the Adirondacks hold their measure. I am a tributary of something greater. In Philadelphia, I'm back in Philadelphia now, and as you can see, I've left Vermont. On a corner in downtown Philadelphia, I would see, and it's very interesting how cities deal with the homeless. Often not with great dignity on behalf of the city or the homeless. But I remember this gentleman who would sit on a corner, and he would look up at the sky, and when I was in graduate school, I recalled him standing there every day, no matter the weather. And then it occurred to me in graduate school that he had a army jacket. And that's all I needed to run with this particular poem. It's called How to Listen. I am going to cock my head tonight like a dog in front of a Glenchie's Tavern on Locust. I am going to stand beside the man who works all day combing his thatch of gray hair, corkscrewed in every direction. I am going to pay attention to our lives unraveling between the forks of his fine-toothed comb. For once, we won't talk about the end of the world, or Vietnam, or his exquisite paper shoes. For once, I am going to ignore the dancing and the profanity and the jukebox so I can hear his head crackle beneath the sky stretch of faint stars. Coming up on a half an hour. Roll Deep takes place, at least the first half of it, takes place in a number of countries. Most of them I visited, and to that extent, the poems feel like poetic travelogues. And I want to read just several of them. I was mentioning earlier about the role of history, and normally when I travel, I'm often thinking about the presence of the past, and that doesn't change where I am. In Rome, among the great ruins, of course, I'm asking myself all kinds of questions that harken back to my childhood in classrooms, learning about the great antiquity. But I'm also, of course, as an African American, thinking about those individuals who fall outside of the official narrative. So there is where I kind of took notes to this particular poem and found out that, of course, I always knew that the Catholic Church had some involvement in the colonization and the trading of humans that we know as slavery. But what I didn't know was that there were official, what we call papal bulls that were written up. And the one that I reference at the end of this poem is called Ruminus Pontifex. And it was the second papal bull, I think written up by Pope Leo X, which allowed for in name of spreading Catholicism, which allowed for first Portugal to colonize West Africa. It gave them the right to claim that particular land. So this is from a long suite of poems called Urban Renewal. This is number 25, set in Italy. Its title is The Augustan Suite, and it's for the great poet Derek Walcott. The blessed will not care what angle they are regarded from. W.H. Auden. Cobbled streets have the burnished look of stone skulls, sinking like a necropolis of Ungolinos from centuries of bewildered tourists stumped in the eternal city, mulling over which way to turn. Every ruin begets a selfie, like a Hollywood set directed to life, then ditched with each phone's shutter click. Past the bronze facade of the Colosseum, ominous as a chipped gold tooth, other crowds follow, like apostles, the voice of a guide, yawning and carrying her flag aloft like a cross. Even here, I look for a history of myself. In the Vatican Museum, I zoomed close to art's record, frescoes, sculptures, altarpieces, and war with pilgrims for the best shot, studying the prose of a guidebook whose prose explains Exekias Amphora, the slave boy delivering clothes to a nude Pollux, or why every Christ child craves the adoration of a black magi, shades frozen in a single hole. The crumbling stone beneath our feet speaks to us. Even Rome's dust possesses something of human grandeur, the elegance of decay. I envy the triumph that certain paintings give back my face. But Romanus Pontifex nearly sealed my fate. I have more hills to climb. From every gift shop, Papa waves at his blessed lambs.
Nice.
So, why don't I read 3 more poems? And thank you very much along the way for your patience and your attentiveness. My wife, who after 4.5 years is finally moving to Vermont, which is a feat on my behalf to leave her. She's in Florida. That's what you don't know. She's in Florida and she's moving to Vermont. Poor lady. And when we first started dating, and I didn't like Florida because I remember the election of 2000, the year of the Chad. You guys remember the Chad? Yeah, remember the Chad. So I didn't like Florida, and I also only associated Florida with Mickey Mouse and Disney. But since our courtship and subsequent marriage, I've gotten to enjoy quite a bit of Florida, particularly its beaches, among other things, which you'll hear here. On Cocoa Beach, I'm revisiting the idea of Florida, giving my vertebrae a vacation from all the faded bouquets of urine in New York and the darkened policies of snow in Vermont. I'm revisiting the idea of my wife's imperial gaze. Her 3-cheese quiche and fluted mimosas are the masters of my mornings. I'm revisiting the idea of lawn furniture. By late afternoon on Sundays, my face blossoms like a passion of lilies as I admire the spectral grace of the sandhill crane, or am caught lost thinking of Castillo de San Marcos or the first people of Temecula. I'm revisiting the idea of light and laughter and skin, half transported by wind. I like to think of myself beside the crepe myrtle, pondering the logos of palm leaves and the kindnesses of beaches. You can have your sororities of pain and darkened subways. I will give myself to the great battles of clouds and surfs. So, on Cocoa Beach, I realized I'm going to read this poem because it appears in this poem too. A poem called Obad, which the poets in the room know that it's a poem particularly for the morning, popularized by the French troubadours. That moment when 2 lovers are saying goodbye in the morning, and its tradition is one of a, what we call it, a carpe diem. Don't go, stay. Let's enjoy the moment. So I'm going to read this, Obad. And it was written after I read a great poem by Richard Wilbur called Late Obad. And it takes its structure from that. Obad, you could be home boiling a pot of tea as you sit on your terrace, reading up on last night's soccer shot beneath a scarf of Saris. You could be diving headlong into the waves of Cocoa Beach, or teaching Mao Zedong, whose theories are easy to reach, or dropping off your dry cleaning, making the new Americans wealthier, or mowing your lawn, greening up. But isn't this healthier? Just imagine the hours you're not squandering away, nor the ant-like minutes frittered with a tentative fiancé. Your whole body agrees you'd rather lie here like a snail in my arms crook, nude and oblivious to all emails. Yes, it's nearly 1 o'clock, but we have more reasons to kiss, to engage in small talk. For one, these blissful seasons are short, and tomorrow is never insured. So bounce downstairs, pour us glasses of whatever, a tray of crackers, Bosch pears, then let drop your sarong, the wind high on your skin, so we can test all day long the notion of original sin. You guys like your carpe diem. That's a good thing. Okay, I said 3, so this is 2.
Don't feel like you need to stop.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The clock is right there, and it's a beautiful clock. So I'm looking at it. That's very nice. That's very nice of you. I don't want to, as my grandmother used to say, wear out my welcome here. On disappearing, which is I want to preface this by saying, one of the things I found as a writer is that you can never envision who will read your work, even if you have an audience in mind. You really can't envision it. Nor can you realize the extent to which people take comfort in one's words or find meaning or some sort of new purchase or appreciation on life because you were able to capture a feeling or an image or take them to a place that they had not previously been before. And so that's happened to me. What's happened to me twice is the fact that I've had people who have read work, and I felt this way reading other writers' work, the extent to which the poem or work has really been meaningful. And I think one of the things that I treasure about poetry is that it's a conversation. It truly is a conversation. And like all the other arts, we are bound as a community who have shared certain poems about people who have served in war, or poems in which someone steals someone's plums and leave them a little note. Those particular poems create community. Poems about stopping on a roadside and cherishing and enjoying the presence of horses. All of those poems. The poems about sitting in a waiting room while your aunt gets her teeth pulled out. All of those poems make us into a community. And in my case, I wrote a particular poem, just happened to write it because some of you will likely ask, what is your process? Well, for me, with this particular poem, I had a particular phrase that I lived with for so long that I decided to write it down. And it was like music in my ears. And that music led me to the words. I can't say that I had much control other than transcribing, but the music led me to the words, and a poem was born. And when I felt moments of lapse, I just simply rewrote those words again, and they would push me further. And I love what the departed, cherished poet who lived here many years in Vermont, Galway Canal would say about writing poems is that sometimes you listen to the poem and you can hear the next words that came to you. And so that's how this poem began, and the Academy of American Poets just sent me an email and asked me for this particular poem, and I sent it to them. They were going to publish it online. Fantastic. As part of their poem a day. Fantastic. I love that they're doing us that bit of service. But they published this poem on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and you'll hear why earlier. And I'm proud of this poem for several reasons, because some of the people who lost family, what we call Ground Zero, Lower Manhattan, reached out to me and let me know how much the poem meant to them. But also, I'm proud of this poem because I was able to finally write a poem, or at least not write a poem about, but acknowledge all those nameless individuals who account for my being here. I know 2 or 3 generations of family. I can go back 2 or 3 generations of family, but beyond that, it's a big mystery. And I have often thought about the number of people who were forced to come here, who survived what must have been a harrowing trip, and then after that, the severity of what it meant to be indentured and serve as a slave. And here I am. My family hails from Georgia and Tennessee, Nashville, in that area, Kentucky. And so I've always wanted to write something that acknowledged my gratitude, and you'll hear that in this poem called On Disappearing. I have not disappeared. The boulevard is full of my steps. The sky is full of my thinking. An archbishop prays for my soul, even though we met only once, and even then he was busy waving at a congregation. The ticking clocks in Vermont sway back and forth as though sweeping up my eyes and my tattoos and my metaphors, and what comes up are the great paragraphs of dust, which also carry motes of my existence. I have not disappeared. My wife quivers inside a kiss. My pulse was given to her many times in many countries. The chunks of bread we dip in olive oil is communion with our ancestors, who also have not disappeared. Their delicate songs I wear on my eyelids. Their smiles have given me freedom, which is a crater I keep falling in. When I bite into the 2 halves of an orange whose cross-section resembles my lungs, a delta of juices bursts down my chin and like magic makes me appear to those who think I've disappeared. It's too bad war makes people disappear like chess pieces, and that prisons turn prisoners into movie endings. When I fade into the mountains on a forest trail, I still have not disappeared, even though its green facade turns my arms and legs into branches of oak. It is then I belong to a southerly wind, which by now you have mistaken as me nodding back and forth like a Hasid in prayer, or mother who has just lost her son to gunfire in Detroit. I have not disappeared. In my children, I see my bulging face pressing further into the mysteries. In a library in Tucson, on a plane above Buenos Aires, on a field where nearby burns a controlled fire, I am held by a professor, a general, and a photographer. One burns a finely wrapped cigar, then sniffs the scented pages of my books, scouring for the bitter smell of control. I hold him in my mind like a chalice. I have not disappeared. I have not disappeared. I swish the amber hue of lager on my tongue and ponder the drilling rigs in the Gulf of Alaska and and pounded the drilling rigs in the Gulf of Alaska and all the oil-painted plovers. When we talk about limits, we disappear. In Jasper, Texas, you can disappear on a strip of gravel. I am a life in sacred language. Termites toil over a grave, and my mind is a ravine of yesterdays. At a glance from across the room, I wear September on my face, which is eternal and does not disappear, even if you close your eyes once and for all, simultaneously, like two coffins. So, my last poem is a poem that I wrote in response to some of the news, some of what was happening in cities, but something that's been going on for a long time. And I want to preface this by saying I think it's important that writers, particularly poets, who are containers of time, which is to say that they are endowed with the privilege of serving as documentarians of our moment, divining it with their language and their words, but also at times like the griot in West Africa, or in Ireland, he's known as the Bard, of calling our attention to some of the great struggles, political and social. And so I thought about the fact that I had given my students at University of Vermont an exercise for about 5 years, and I've never done it myself, which is to write a prose poem. And after our great conversations of whether or not a poem that doesn't have line breaks could be a poem, we would all set off to writing one. And this is one that I wrote that kind of is dealing with something very important to me. But I also want to say that when one addresses the political and social issues of their time, it doesn't mean that they have to forget or forego the role of the imagination. We don't want art that stands in as polemics or as a protest phrase, but art that is art that becomes meaningful. So I want to read this poem. It'll be my last poem, and I thank you for being here, called Ferguson, a prose poem. Once there was a boy who thought it a noble idea to lie down in the middle of the street and sleep. For 4 hours, no one bothered him, but let him lay on the road as though he were an enchantment. This became newsworthy, and soon helicopters hovered above, hosing his curled torso and thick legs, and spotlights televised the world over. Foreign correspondents focused on the neighborhood and its relative poverty as recognized by the plethora of low-hanging jeans worn by shirtless men and loud music issuing from passing cars, which had the effect of drowning out everyone's already bottled up thoughts about the boy sleeping in the middle of the street. Others jumped in front of cameras, seizing an opportunity to be seen by their relatives on the other side of town because they had run out of minutes on prepaid cell phones. The roadkill in the neighborhood, and some on that very block, rats, rodents, cats, and possums, feeling equal amounts of jealousy and futility, each began to rise and return to their den holes, cursing the boy sleeping in the street beneath their breaths for his virtuosic performance of stillness and tribulation in the city. The drug-addicted men and homeless women leaning into doorways like art installations were used to being ignored, but they too felt affronted by the boys sleeping in the street and folded their cardboard homes. For the first hour, he practiced not breathing. For 10 seconds, he would hold his breath, and then he practiced longer sets of minutes during the next 3 hours until he was able to stretch out his non-breathing for whole hunks at a time. When his breathing returned, it was so faint, his chest and shoulders barely moved. Infinitesimal amounts of life poured out of him, but no one noticed. The police cordoned off his body, and after some time declared him dead, because they had only seen black men lying prone on the street as corpses, but never as sleeping humans. The whole world, eager and hungry for a Lazarus moment, watched and waited to see when he would awaken and rise to his feet, especially his neighbors with minutes remaining on cell phones who filmed and animatedly discoursed behind yellow tape the ecstasies and muted sorrows of watching a boy sleep in the middle of the street.
Wow.
Thank you.
Where do we buy your books?
Good question. I don't want to send you to Amazon, even though you could find it there, but I bet down the street they will have your books. Is it still down there? Everywhere. Yeah. Wonderful. Yes. Thank you for asking that question. Most important of all the questions to ask, of course. Yes.
You don't have any here tonight.
No, I didn't arrive with any.
You're holding a book, you have a book up on the table. Could you give us the title?
Yes.
I would like to buy one.
Sure, thank you so much. It's called Roll Deep. And
Goodness.
someone recently asked me why this title. And when I was younger and I first started writing and sharing my work with my family, inevitably someone would say, "That's real deep." Okay.
Were most of the poems you read tonight in that book?
Yes, they were. Thank you.
I want a copy.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I like that title for the echo of Real Deep, but also one of the things that I was mentioning earlier about the conversation that we have with each other vis-a-vis the arts. And Eliot talks about tradition and the individual talent. This idea that we read, those of us who are writers, we read to discover our own voice. And while I have been influenced, definitely by other poets, I also find myself in conversation with everyday people, family, people that I grew up with in Tennessee, activists, philosophers, fiction writers, dancers. And so this idea of Roll Deep, which is really comes from my generation's notion of community, you can think of it in that sense. I'm quite honored and feel compelled always when I sit down to write to address some of what I read or some of the conversations that have been meaningful for me. So that's where that title, that's the meaning of that title. Real deep, enrolled. Yes.
This is the second time I've heard you read. And I want to tell you that listening to you, for the moment, the world is right. So I also want to thank you for this connection between Philadelphia and Vermont. I spent most of my summers in a project in South Philadelphia, and my oldest son was born in Philadelphia, went to Pearl Buck, and came to me. So he's gone from Philadelphia to Vermont also.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
thanks for that connection.
Thank you. Thank you. A little anecdote. I wrote a poem I write a number of poems that feature art and the artist. And someone asked me, why you're interested in art. And then I had to let them know that my aunt was a security guard at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And when it was hot, she would say, "It's cool in here. Come in here. I'll get you in free." And so if you know Philadelphia Museum of Art, you know that every kid loves the arms and armor section. That's where I kind of hung out. And then as I grew up, I visited other galleries. One time she said, when we arrived, she said, "Go out back. They're filming a movie and they need kids. And they need kids to run up the steps behind this guy." Rocky 2. I can't tell you how many times I rented that movie and looked for Little Major, which I can't recognize myself if he was there. But Philadelphia has been quite meaningful for me. I have a number of friends who've gone on to become either musicians or visual artists. It was a great place to be nurtured.
We have a question up here on the mezzanine.
Yeah.
Thank you. 2 questions. One, do you dream in black and white or color?
Hmm.
And then how do your dreams inform what you write during the day?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. 2 reasons. One, I swear to God, this is no lie. When I moved to Vermont, I was dreaming in green. That's the truth. It didn't last long, but I was like, God, it's so rich here. The other reason why I appreciate that question, because it allows me to talk about when I write, which is often in the mornings, very early, or late at night, just before I'm about to go to sleep. I never find myself, as much as I would like to be, I never find myself productive during the day hours when the great busyness of our lives is swirling. And writing during those hours, as a number of people know, allows you to kind of easily tap into the subconscious and allow all manners of images and thoughts to freely associate. And as a result of that, I have found some dreams to find their way in the most, in the best sense, in the surrealist sense. Some of them are inscrutable to me. When I have this dream, it hasn't gotten into a poem, but I've been trying to work it into a poem. My mother sitting on a raft in the Atlantic Ocean having tea with Bill Clinton. Who knows why my subconscious is like created that, but I thought, that's an interesting scenario. Bill Clinton and my mom alone on a raft in the ocean. I wonder what Freud would say about that. But we're lucky. I mean, at one point I had dream dictionaries. I kept a dream journal. And I like for it to be, I don't like chasing dreams. That's the other thing. I'd rather for them to arise during their process rather than transcribing them. My other obsession these days that's informing my poems is what do we call them? Hold on, it's gonna come to me. Superstitions. Superstitions. I've been collecting superstitions. So if at some point you want to share one with me, I would be very appreciative. That's the other space of knowledge that's informing a great deal of my work.
Do you recall your first poem, what the experience was for you? What prompted that? Were you a little kid or were you grown up yet?
Yeah, I was not quite a grown-up. I was in my early teens. And I hate to repeat this because you can probably predict this, which was my generation's generation of hip-hop. And my first, the writing that got me closest to language was rap and trying to be a rapper myself. And so although I wasn't terribly good, I can't even say any good, I was actually going in the other direction. What I loved about it was the echoes and the words in my mouth. I love that experience. What it was about, probably predictably about either a whack MC or a girl that I liked, one or the other, at that early teen. I can't even, in fact, I'm looking at my papers because I'm looking at old writings, and some stuff I will sell, and other stuff I'm just gonna hold on to because it's so dreadfully awful. Yeah. Right over there. Yeah.
In your writing, when you were growing up, who were some of the most influential poets for you, inspirational, and are those people still influential and inspirational for you?
Oh yeah, thank you for asking that question. My teacher in college was a great poet, and in my mind, someone who should be a national treasure, the poet Sonia Sanchez, who is from New York, but has written about and written through so much of what has shaped us today. She was born in 1934, so by the time I was born, she was already, had lived a full life, and then would go on and become an important voice of African Americans and women, and someone who I would say kind of maybe essentially turned me on to the power of poetry, which is to address all of which we share as human beings, despite where we were born, despite what station in life we were born into, despite creed, despite religion. And that's very simply a question that she asks over and over again, which is, what does it mean to be human? And so she was a teacher of mine, and several poets, Yusef Kumayaka is a great poet, Derek Walcott, Joseph Brodsky, the great Russian poet, W.H. Auden, the British poet, Yeats. I can go on and on. Gwendolyn Brooks. Did I say Gwendolyn Brooks? Did I say Gwendolyn Brooks? Anyone here? Gwendolyn Brooks? Yeah, was an important person who supported, and in very characteristic ways, when, the fact of the matter is that when you're first starting out writing, you can best believe it's dreadfully awful. And some people will tell you, and then other people won't tell you because they're angels. And they kind of encourage you to go on. And I was fortunate enough to have her and others that said, keep striving, keep writing. Thank you for that question.
We have one more upstairs.
Hey there. I was wondering what inspired you to use a Kehinde Wiley painting as the cover of Real Deep, and that one in particular, because I know that the adage is don't judge a book by its cover, but it's like something that we all
Yeah.
do sometimes.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you feel like there's a relationship between your art and
Yes,
his
thank
art.
you for asking that question. It's been very important for me to ask my publisher to put the paintings of black artists on the cover. I think it's activist at the same time that it is, I find great inspiration, as you probably heard from artists. And Kehinde is someone that I feel a distinct kinship, owed to the fact that so much of his paintings appropriate classical paintings. So what Kehinde does, Kehinde Wiley is his name, what he does is he takes, he stages scenes of classical paintings, but he inserts, at least for the first 8 to 10 years of his career, black men in those particular positions. And so you might see a picture of, let's say, Napoleon on a horse, but he will repaint it with a guy that looks like he's from Harlem. In fact, most likely, he was from Harlem, and he probably dresses like he's from Harlem. And so that appropriation of classical imagery is the equivalent of what I try to do with poetry, whether it be in forms or in certain conversations. And I'm more than delighted that you recognized his work. Thank you. I think you had a question, sir? Yeah.
May I?
Yeah.
Could you speak to, this is a subject very close to my heart. In Eastern Europe and in Central and South America, poets and their poems were part of the public consciousness, if you will, the political consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that not true in America?
You know, I am deeply moved by that question, because I do feel as though you're lucky. I think the great wonder of any literary art form is that it speaks to your interior reality or your external reality. You're fortunate if you're able to encounter words on the page that through its imagery or the force of its logic or its rhetoric or some aspect really speaks to you. All of us who are readers knows what that feeling is like. But then you might encounter a poem or short story or play that raises your consciousness and inspires you towards change. And Eastern European poets had that kind of effect on their communities. And I cannot, for the life of me, except to say that there's all manner of distractions here. There's a level of comfort, and the poets like Czesław Miłosz and Adam Zagajewski and Wisława Szymborska, who, by the way, and poets of my generation, some of whom I'm friends with, who resist overtly political poetry, still inevitably work to capture the human spirit. And what an empowering moment. I cannot quite, for the life of me, understand that. Although, I would say how amazing it would be if we celebrated poets who did not merely write about the trees or bird baths in Connecticut, but wrote poetry like Philip Levine that celebrated the working man, or Afa Weaver, who also writes poetry about working class people, or Martina Spada, or Adrienne Rich, or Sonia Sanchez, or Mary Baraka, Ntozake Shange. There's a number of poets for whom I wish we would put their names and faces on stamps, you know, name institutions or streets after them. I can't tell you, when I was in Paris, I saw the name Victor Hugo Boulevard. I was like, they have streets named after poets? Wouldn't that be cool, right? If your poet laureate here in Brattleboro had their own street, how cool would that be, right? So I do think some of it has to do with the extent to which we value and celebrate voices among us, not dead or alive. I love Walt Whitman. I love Emily Dickinson. I love Langston Hughes. But living voices today who kind of rise above and go to those spaces that are maybe dangerous, maybe risky, maybe that utter what some of us or all of us feel. I think it would be really wonderful. And let's give them a lot of money to continue what they're doing. You know? We're done.
One more question.
Yes.
If there's any.
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering, you were saying that your poetry is to start a conversation. For your writing in general, what conversation do you hope to start with it? Or you can't really, like, you never know where something is going to go, but what would be your ultimate goal?
Well, there are several, I think. One of them having to do with the last bit. I was in Western Carolina. 2:45 a.m. I woke up, hit the alarm, drove 3 hours to Charlotte, North Carolina, and took a plane to DC that got me back to Burlington to teach. And one image that sticks in my head is the rebel flag. And I saw it at least 10 times. Not to say that I haven't seen it here in Vermont, but it's here. And so one of the conversations that I'm, as you could probably predict, invested in is how do we treat each other like humans? How do we not draw up barriers between us? That's one conversation. Another conversation that I feel intimately connected to is, and maybe predictably, is not only what does it mean to be human, but one of my earliest reading experiences was Camus. And I'm very interested in existence. And as someone who grew up in a church, that was one kind of answer. And I think there are many explanations for why we're here. And frankly, I think along those lines, I think writing poetry, sitting at my desk every day is the closest that I get to prayer, because it forces me to stop and consider what doesn't present itself as a great, deep philosophic question. Like, when I'm at Starbucks, I don't think, once they handed me my cappuccino, what is the meaning of life? That just doesn't happen. But when I sit at my desk, I'm engaged in all manner of discussion. And if I'm stumped, I often will pick up the books in my library and just randomly turn to a page or go and visit a favorite poem, which always. So my ultimate, you asked me what would I like. There's this idea that, and I don't remember who, but someone said we're lucky to get one poem that enters into the collective ear of the human tribe. I would be deeply honored to have one poem that everyone knew. And that, not just that they knew, but it was really meaningful for them. You know, stopping by the woods. We real cool. A deferred dream. You must change your life, Rilke. You know, so even a phrase or a word or two. If you can attribute that to me, I would be in heaven. Thank you very much.
Thank you.